lost in some bad investment, given away, on purpose, by my own parents, to my little sister, for a wedding she hadn't even asked for yet. If you've ever had the floor disappear from under you while you were standing perfectly still, you already know how this story starts. Stick with me until the end, because what happened after that phone call still makes my hands shake when I think about it. And the way this family finally got what was coming to them is not something you want to miss. The phone call that changed everything. My name doesn't matter for this story, so let's just say I was 22, 3 weeks away from starting my master's program, and sitting in my apartment eating cold noodles out of the container when my phone rang. It was my mother. She never called just to chat, so I already had a bad feeling before I even picked up. "Sweetheart," she said, in that voice she used whenever she wanted something or needed to soften bad news, "we need to talk about the fund." I remember putting my fork down very slowly. The fund. My college fund. The one my grandfather had set up before he died, the one my parents had been managing for me since I was 14, the one that was supposed to cover my graduate tuition because my undergrad had already drained most of my personal savings and a chunk of loans I was still paying off. "What about it?" I asked, even though some part of me already knew. "Your sister is getting engaged," my mother said, like this was the most natural connection in the world. "James proposed last weekend, and honestly, with the way wedding costs are these days, your father and I felt it made more sense to use the fund for the wedding instead. You can always take out loans for your masters. Weddings, you only get once." I want you to sit with that sentence for a second. You can always take out loans for your masters, as if debt was a minor inconvenience, a speed bump, something you shake off like rain. As if 4 years of my life spent maintaining a scholarship-adjacent GPA, working 2 jobs during undergrad, and planning every single financial decision around this one fund meant nothing next to a wedding that hadn't even been planned yet. "How much did you take?" I asked, and my voice came out flatter than I expected. "All of it," she said. "It just made sense, honey. Don't be dramatic about this." Don't be dramatic. 2 words that, in hindsight, set the entire tone for what my family would spend the next several months trying to convince me to feel. Don't be dramatic when your future gets rewritten without your permission. Don't be dramatic when a decision that will follow you for a decade gets made in a 5-minute phone call while you're eating noodles out of a plastic container. Meet the family. Let me back up, because you need to understand the dynamics here to really feel the weight of what happened. My sister, I'll call her Lily, is 2 years younger than me. Growing up, Lily was the golden child in every sense of the word. Not because she did anything particularly extraordinary, but because she had a talent for making our parents feel needed. She'd call crying about small things, ask for advice on decisions she'd already made, and somehow always end up the center of every family gathering. I was the independent one, which sounds like a compliment until you realize what it actually meant in our house. The one who doesn't need to be checked on, doesn't need extra support, doesn't need anything. Being independent in my family meant being invisible unless something was needed from me. My parents, David and Carol, weren't cruel people in any obvious way. They didn't yell, they didn't hit, they never forgot a birthday. But there was always this quiet arithmetic running underneath every decision they made, one where Lily's needs were emergencies and mine were requests. When Lily wanted a car at 18, they found the money. When I wanted a car at 18, I got a lecture about financial responsibility and a part-time job at a grocery store. So when they told me the fund was gone, some old, tired part of me wasn't even surprised. It just confirmed something I had spent years trying not to notice. The excuses begin. Over the next few days, I got a flood of messages, not apologies, explanations. My father called to tell me that family helps family, and that a wedding was a once-in-a-lifetime investment in Lily's future happiness. He said this with a straight face, apparently not noticing the irony of using the word investment for a wedding while dismissing my actual education, my actual future, as something that could wait. My mother sent a long text about how she assumed I would understand since I was always so mature about money. That word mature had been used against me my whole life. Being mature meant being expected to need less. It meant my maturity was treated as a resource to be spent, not a trait to be respected. Then Lily called. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity won. "I just want you to know I didn't ask for this," she said, and for a second I almost believed her. Almost. "Mom and Dad just told me they wanted to help with the wedding, and I said okay. I didn't know it was your college money specifically." I asked her directly, "If you had known it was my tuition money, would you have said no?" There was a pause, a long one. "I mean, James and I really want a nice wedding," she said. "But I didn't know, okay, don't be mad at me." Don't be mad at me. Don't be dramatic. Two phrases, one family, and a pattern that had been running my entire life finally showing itself in broad daylight. Doing the math on my own future. That first week, I didn't sleep much. I sat with my laptop open at 2 in the morning, staring at my program's tuition breakdown, trying to calculate exactly how deep a hole I was standing in. The number wasn't small. It was the kind of number that reorganizes your entire 5-year plan in a single glance. I want to be honest with you. My first instinct wasn't fury. It was grief. A strange, hollow kind of grief, like mourning a version of my life that had just been erased without my consent. I had pictured myself walking into that program without the weight of loans hanging over me. I had pictured graduating and being able to make career decisions based on passion instead of desperation, because I wouldn't be drowning in debt. That version of my life was gone, replaced overnight by a version where every decision for the next decade would be shaped by a wedding I wasn't even sure I wanted to attend. It took a few days for the grief to curdle into something colder, something clearer. Because here's the thing about being the independent one in a family like mine. You learn to solve your own problems. You learn to stop waiting for people to fix things for you. And once the shock wore off, that old instinct kicked back in, except this time it wasn't going to just mean quietly figuring out loans and moving on like I always had before. This time, I decided, if my family wanted to treat my future like an inconvenience, I was going to make sure they understood exactly what they'd chosen instead. The quiet investigation. I didn't confront anyone right away. Instead, I started asking questions, carefully, calmly, the way you do when you actually want answers instead of an argument. I asked my mother exactly how the fund had been structured. Turned out my grandfather had set it up as a trust with my parents as custodians for the education of his grandchildren, meaning technically, legally, both Lily and I had some claim to it. But the trust documents specified education, not weddings, not venues, not photographers or 5-tier cakes. I found this out because I finally did something I probably should have done years earlier. I called the family lawyer directly. My grandfather had used the same estate attorney for decades, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane who had actually drafted the trust herself. When I explained what had happened, there was a long silence on the other end of the phone. They withdrew all of it. "For a wedding?" she asked, and I could hear something shift in her voice, something between disbelief and quiet anger on my behalf. "Every cent," I said. "That trust was explicitly designated for education-related expenses," she told me. "Your parents were custodians, not owners. What they did may not have been strictly illegal depending on how the trust language was written, but it absolutely was not what your grandfather intended, and depending on the exact wording, it could open them up to some very uncomfortable questions." I sat with that information for a long moment. Uncomfortable questions. I liked the sound of that. Building the case. Here's where I need you to understand something about me. I'm not the type of person who explodes in the moment. I simmer. I plan. I wait until I have everything I need before I make a move, and once I move with precision. Diane agreed to review the original trust documents in detail. It took about a week, but what she found was exactly what I suspected. The trust specified funds could be used only for qualified educational expenses of the named beneficiaries, and named both Lily and myself explicitly, individually, by name, with the funds intended to be split for each of our educations, not pooled for one sibling's non-educational expenses. Meaning my parents hadn't just made a hurtful choice. They had potentially breached the legal terms of a trust that was never fully theirs to redirect in the first place. I sat on this information for a few days, deciding exactly how I wanted to use it. Confrontation without leverage is just venting. I wanted leverage. While I waited, I did something else. I quietly reached out to a few of my grandfather's old friends, people who had known him well, people who had been at the reading of his will. I didn't tell them what had happened. I just asked, gently, curiously, what my grandfather had said about the fund when he set it up. One of them, a retired professor named Walter who had been close with my grandfather for decades, told me something that stopped me cold. He talked about that fund a lot in his last year, Walter said. He was worried, actually, that your parents might play favorites. He specifically said he hoped whoever managed it would treat both of you fairly because he'd noticed. Well, he noticed things too. He said if anything ever felt unfair to either of you, you should feel free to ask questions. He wanted you both protected. I hadn't cried through any of the initial shock, the phone calls, the excuses. But hearing that my grandfather had somehow anticipated this exact betrayal, had tried to build in protection against it, and that protection had been ignored anyway, that's when I finally broke down. But it didn't stay grief for long. It turned into resolve. The family dinner. I requested a family dinner. Not a confrontation, not yet just dinner, the four of us. My parents were thrilled, actually, because in their minds, my silence over the past 2 weeks meant I had come around to accepting the situation. My mother even texted, "So glad you're not being dramatic about this anymore," which I saved as a screenshot, because I had a feeling I'd want to remember exactly how confident she was in that moment. Lily showed up with her fiancé James, practically glowing, already talking about venues and flower arrangements. My father made his favorite pasta. My mother poured wine and talked about how family always finds a way to work things out. I let them get through most of dinner before I spoke. "I talked to Diane," I said. The table went quiet. My mother's smile faltered slightly, though she tried to keep it in place. "Diane who?" "Grandpa's lawyer, the one who set up the education trust." My father set his fork down carefully. "Why would you do that?" "Because I wanted to understand exactly what that fund was legally supposed to be used for," I said, keeping my voice level calm, almost conversational. "And it turns out it was never actually yours to give away. It was specifically designated by name for both Lily's and my education, not for weddings, not for anything else." My mother's face went through several emotions very quickly. Confusion, then defensiveness, then something close to panic. "We were the custodians," she said. "We had discretion over how." "You had discretion over how to manage it for its intended purpose," I said. "Not discretion to redirect it entirely to something the trust explicitly didn't cover." Diane was very clear about that. She's already drafted a letter, actually, outlining the exact terms that were breached. I hadn't planned to say that last part quite so early, but the look on my father's face made it worth it. "You had a lawyer send us a letter," he said, his voice rising, "over a family matter. You made it a legal matter the moment you spent trust funds outside their designated purpose," I said. "I just made sure someone qualified confirmed that for me." The fallout. I wish I could tell you the room erupted into some satisfying, dramatic confrontation where everyone admitted wrongdoing and apologized. That's not how real families work, though, is it? Instead, What happened was quieter and somehow more revealing. My mother started crying, not the kind of crying that comes from genuine remorse, but the kind that comes from being caught and wanting sympathy instead of accountability. She kept saying things like, "I can't believe you do this to your own family." And this is exactly the kind of dramatic overreaction I was worried about. As if the real crime here was my response, not their original decision. My father tried a different approach, appealing to guilt. "Your grandfather would be devastated to see the family fighting like this," he said, which was almost funny, considering it was Walter, my grandfather's own close friend, who had confirmed exactly what my grandfather feared might happen. Lily, to her credit, actually looked uncomfortable for the first time since this had all started. "Wait," she said slowly, looking between our parents. "You told me the fund was like a family savings thing. You didn't say it was specifically split for both of us." My mother didn't answer that, which told me everything I needed to know about how this had actually been framed to Lily in the first place. She hadn't been told the full truth either. She had simply been handed something and told it was hers to enjoy, no questions asked, the same way she'd been handed most things her whole life. James, to his credit, looked deeply uncomfortable being present for what was clearly turning into a financial and legal reckoning at his future in-law's dinner table. I let the silence stretch for a moment before I laid out what I actually wanted. What I actually asked for. I wasn't interested in destroying my family. I want to be clear about that because I know some of you listening might expect this story to end with lawsuits and permanently broken relationships. And while that might make for a more explosive ending, it's not what happened. And honestly, it's not what I wanted. What I wanted was simple. The trust had been broken, but the money that had gone toward the wedding could still, legally, be partially recovered or restructured, since the wedding hadn't happened yet and much of it hadn't been spent. Diane had outlined a path where my parents could reallocate whatever funds remained, cover a portion of my tuition directly out of pocket to make up the difference for what had already been spent, and formally acknowledge in writing that the trust had been misused. I wasn't asking for revenge. I was asking for correction. My father, unsurprisingly, resisted at first. He talked about how unreasonable it was to expect them to suddenly produce that kind of money, completely missing the irony that the unreasonable expectation had actually been mine, expecting to keep the education fund my grandfather had left me. But here's where the leverage mattered. Diane had made it clear that if this wasn't resolved amicably, the next step would involve formally challenging the trust's administration, which could have opened my parents up to real legal and financial consequences, not to mention an uncomfortable public paper trail. My parents, who valued their reputation in our extended family and community deeply, did not want that. So slowly, painfully, over the next month things shifted. The slow unraveling and rebuilding. My parents ended up covering a significant portion of my first year's tuition directly, pulling from savings they had clearly been reluctant to touch, which told me a lot about how easily they'd been willing to spend my education fund instead of their own money in the first place. It wasn't the full original amount, and I ended up still taking on some loans, but it was a real correction, not just an apology with no substance behind it. Lily, to her surprise, ended up scaling back the wedding significantly once she understood where the money had actually come from. I don't think it was purely guilt. I think some of it was genuine discomfort at realizing her own parents had misled her about the source of her wedding funds. She and James ended up having a smaller, simpler wedding than originally planned. And honestly, from what I heard, it turned out to be more meaningful because of it, not less. My relationship with my parents did not magically heal. I want to be honest about that too, because I think stories like this sometimes get wrapped up too neatly. There were months of tension after that dinner. My mother would occasionally bring up how hurtful it was that I'd involved a lawyer, completely sidestepping her own role in starting this entire situation. My father became quieter around me, the kind of quiet that comes from someone who knows they were wrong but isn't ready to fully say it. But something did shift. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the invisible, independent one who solved her own problems silently in the background while my sister's needs took center stage. I had made myself impossible to overlook, not through anger, but through preparation, through knowledge, through refusing to accept "don't be dramatic" as an answer to a genuinely dramatic betrayal. What I learned. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. Being the responsible one in a family does not mean your needs matter less. It does not mean your future is more disposable than someone else's. For years, I equated being easy, being low maintenance, being independent with being loved. What I learned through all of this is that being easy often just means being easy to overlook. I also learned that quiet, careful action can be more powerful than loud confrontation. I didn't scream at my parents. I didn't post about it online, tagging them, trying to publicly shame them into doing the right thing. I gathered information. I understood my actual rights. I brought receipts, literal legal receipts, to a conversation that my family had assumed would just be another moment where I quietly accepted less than I deserved. And maybe most importantly, I learned that grandparents sometimes see more than we realize. My grandfather, without ever explicitly saying it to my face, had tried to protect me from exactly this kind of moment. He didn't stop it from happening, but he made sure that when it did happen, I had the tools to fight back if I was willing to use them. Where things stand now. Today, my tuition is mostly covered between the partial repayment my parents made and the loans I ended up taking for the remainder. It's not the debt-free path I had originally pictured, but it's significantly lighter than it would have been if I hadn't pushed back. Lily and I actually talk more now than we used to, strangely enough. I think seeing our parents' dynamic laid out so plainly, the favoritism, the assumptions, the quiet arithmetic of whose needs counted as emergencies, made her start noticing patterns she'd never had to notice before, since she'd always been on the comfortable side of them. My parents and I are civil. We spend holidays together. But there's a new kind of honesty in our relationship now, an unspoken understanding that I am no longer someone whose future can be quietly deprioritized without consequence. I don't know if that's the relationship every family podcast wants to hear about, the kind with a big, tearful reconciliation scene, but it's real and it's mine, and for the first time, it's built on something closer to respect than assumption. There's one more moment from that period I still think about often. A few weeks after the dinner, once the dust had mostly settled, my father asked to meet me alone for coffee. No lawyers, no scripts, just the two of us at a small table by the window of a place we used to go to when I was a kid. He didn't apologize outright, not in so many words, but he said something that stuck with me. I think we got so used to Lily needing things loudly and you needing things quietly that we stopped noticing the difference between quiet and nothing, he said, staring into his cup instead of at me. That's on us, not on you. It wasn't a full reckoning. It didn't undo the weeks of stress, the sleepless nights doing tuition math, the sting of hearing "don't be dramatic" used against me like a weapon. But it was the first time either of my parents had said, out loud, that the imbalance had been real and not something I'd imagined or exaggerated. For someone who had spent years being told her feelings about fairness were overreactions, that small acknowledgement meant more than any amount of repaid tuition money ever could. I've thought a lot since then about why this story stuck with people when I first shared pieces of it with close friends. I think it's because so many of us have a version of this in our own families. Maybe not a college fund, maybe not a wedding, but some moment where we quietly realized our needs had been ranked below someone else's without anyone ever actually saying so out loud. It's rarely dramatic in the moment. It's usually just a phone call, a passing comment, a decision made without you in the room, and then suddenly you're left holding the pieces of a plan you didn't know was breakable. What made the difference for me wasn't fury. It was refusing to let the quiet moment stay quiet. It was picking up the phone and calling a lawyer instead of just accepting a narrative that had already been decided for me. It was choosing, for once, to make my invisible expectations impossible to ignore. So if you're out there right now, the responsible one, the independent one, the one everyone assumes doesn't need extra support, I hope this story reminds you of something important. Needing less does not mean deserving less. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to be loud. It's to be prepared. If this story hit close to home for you, or if you've ever had to fight to be seen in your own family, I'd genuinely love to hear about it. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because trust me, this was far from the most dramatic thing that's ever landed in my inbox.